My daughter-in-law's mother stood in the middle of my workshop, running her hand along the lathe like she was pricing it for an estate sale. She smiled at me over her shoulder, easy and warm. The way you smile at somebody you've already decided doesn't matter anymore. This whole place would make a beautiful little Airbnb, she said. Rustic charm sells itself these days. I didn't answer her right away, because there was one thing I understood better than anyone standing in that barn that morning. A family word isn't a deed. It doesn't matter how many times somebody says someday this'll be ours out loud someday isn't a legal document, and it never will be. By the time that woman finished measuring my late husband's workshop for a stranger's weekend getaway, I'd already called the one person who could make her understand that in writing. My name is Walter Higgins. I'm 66, born and raised outside Asheville, North Carolina, and I spent 34 years as a master furniture maker before my hands started arguing with me about it. I have one son, Michael. He's 31, quiet in the way his father was quiet, the kind of quiet that means he's still turning something over, not that he's got nothing to say. My wife Ellen passed 4 years ago. Heart, sudden, no warning, no long goodbye. I don't dress it up because there's nothing to dress. One Tuesday she was pruning the roses, and by Thursday I was picking out a casket. If you've ever had somebody walk into the one place that still smells like the person you lost and start talking about square footage, you already know the particular kind of cold I mean. Stay with me, because what happened over that summer taught me more about my own family than the previous 30 years combined. Ellen and I built that workshop with our own hands back in 1994, the same year we finished paying off the land. It started as a 2-car garage kit from a lumber yard in Weaverville, but I tore out the walls the first winter and built it into something better. Full workbench along the east side, a wood stove Ellen picked out herself because she said a workshop without heat was just a shed with delusions, and enough space for the cabinetry business I ran out of there for nearly 3 decades. Ellen used to bring me coffee out there every morning at 7, rain or shine, in a chipped green mug that said World's Okayest Cook, a joke gift from Michael's 4th grade Father's Day fare that somehow became hers instead of mine. She'd sit on the old church pew I'd restored and watch me work and not say much of anything, and that was enough for both of us. After she died, I didn't go out there for almost 2 months. The sawdust smell was too much like her standing in the doorway. Eventually I started again, small projects first. A birdhouse, a cutting board, nothing that mattered, just enough to remember how my hands used to work before grief made them clumsy. That spring I decided to restore the whole building properly. New roof, rewired the outlets, refinished the floor, Ellen always said, squeaked out an apology whenever you walked across it wrong. I wasn't doing it to sell the place. I was doing it because I wanted it standing and solid for whatever came next in this family, whether that was Michael needing space someday or grandchildren learning to sand a board the way I once taught him. Michael had married Priya Anand 2 years back. Priya was sharp, funny, ran a physical therapy practice in town, and I liked her plenty, still do, for what it's worth. Her mother, though, Deborah Anand. Deborah had sold real estate in 3 different states and talked about property values the way other people talk about weather, constantly and with total confidence that everyone else wanted to hear it. Her husband, Frank, mostly nodded along and refilled his own glass. I never disliked Deborah outright. I just noticed, early on, that she looked at things the way an appraiser looks at things, not the way a guest does. The trouble started on a Wednesday in June. I'd driven the 11 minutes from my house out to the property. Ellen and I had always kept the workshop on a separate parcel from the main house, an old habit from when the business needed its own address for deliveries, because I had a contractor named Tomas coming by at 11 to look at replacing the old sliding barn door before it fell clean off its track. I remember the time exactly because I'd stopped at the diner on Merrimon for a biscuit first, and the cashier told me I still had 20 minutes to kill if I didn't drive like I was late for my own funeral. I told her I was saving that particular drive for later in life. She laughed harder than the joke deserved. I left her a good tip anyway. It was a soft morning, low fog still sitting in the hollow, birds loud in the way they only get right after a rain. I had a thermos of coffee in the cup holder and a set of new hinges on the passenger seat because I'd planned to fix the workshop's side door while I waited on Tomas. I turned onto the gravel drive at 10:41, and the first thing that struck me wrong was the gate hanging wide open, not broken open, just open, the way it only gets when somebody who knows the code walks through it without a second thought. Then I saw the tire tracks, fresh and wide in the mud from the overnight rain, wider than any car Michael or Priya drove. When the workshop came into view, I counted 3 vehicles I didn't put there myself. A silver Lexus SUV I recognized as Deborah's, a rental car with an unfamiliar sticker still in the back window, and parked crooked near the side door. A cargo van with a magnetic sign on the door that read Coastline Staging and Design. My new hinges sat forgotten on the seat beside me. Somebody had already dragged Ellen's church pew out onto the gravel, and there were folding tables set up where my workbench should have been, covered in swatches of fabric and paint chips. Music was playing low from a speaker somewhere inside, that easy, unbothered volume people use when they believe wholeheartedly they belong exactly where they're standing. I sat in the truck a good 15 seconds before I moved. That's something age teaches you, if you let it. You don't sprint into every fire you find. You look, you count what you're seeing. You decide whether it's a misunderstanding or something with teeth. Then I turned off the engine, pocketed my phone, and walked up the gravel toward my own workshop. The side door stood propped open with a paint can. I stepped through and found Deborah Anand standing at my workbench with a tape measure stretched across it, calling out numbers to a younger woman I didn't know who was writing them down on a clipboard. Frank sat on an overturned crate near the wood stove, scrolling his phone. A man I'd never met was up on a stepladder near the rafters, photographing the ceiling beams with a real camera, not a phone. And there, laid across two sawhorses where I usually kept lumber drying, sat a folded stack of what looked like marketing brochures. I picked one up without asking anyone's permission. The Higgins Barn, Rustic, Luxury, Retreat. Booking Spring 2027. For a second, nobody in that room noticed me at all. Then Deborah looked up, saw me standing in my own doorway holding my own workshop's future funeral announcement, and smiled. Not startled. Not caught. Smiled, wide and warm, like I'd shown up early to a party she'd already planned in my honor. "Walter," she said, spreading one arm out like she was presenting the room to me. "Perfect timing. Come see what we're thinking." I looked at the tape measure still stretched across my bench. I looked at the man on the ladder photographing beams Ellen had helped me hang 30 years ago. Then I looked back at Deborah. "What are you doing in my workshop?" The younger woman with the clipboard lowered it slowly, like she'd just walked into a conversation that wasn't hers. Deborah laughed. Easy, unbothered. "Walter, relax. Priya gave us the gate code months ago, back when we were watching the house during your trip to see your sister. We've just been talking through some ideas." "Ideas for what?" I said. "For the property," she said, like it was obvious. "Michael mentioned you'd been talking about downsizing eventually, simplifying things now that it's just you. Frank and I have contacts in vacation rentals. We could have this place generating real income within a year. Family should help family see opportunities. Walter, you know how that goes." I hadn't said one word to Michael about downsizing. Not one. I took a step further into the room. "This isn't a vacation property. This is my workshop." It was my wife's, too. Deborah's smile thinned just slightly at the corners, the way people's smiles do when they're recalculating rather than backing down. Frank glanced up from his phone for the first time. "Deborah, Walter," she said, using my own name back at me like a correction. "Michael's your only child. Priya's his wife. One day, realistically, all of this becomes theirs anyway. We're not outsiders here. We're planning ahead, that's all this is." The man on the ladder chuckled softly, still photographing, not even bothering to climb down. Deborah gestured toward the loft space above the bench. "We were even thinking, once it's converted, this could sleep 6 easily. Get ahead of the market before interest rates climb again. I have built things with my hands my whole working life. I know the difference between a plan and a threat dressed up as helpfulness." Standing in that workshop, watching a stranger photograph the ceiling my wife once handed me nails for, one board at a time, I felt something colder than anger settle into my chest. I felt the exact moment my hurt turned into something with a record attached to it. I pulled out my phone. Deborah's eyes tracked the movement. "Who are you calling?" she said, and for the first time that morning some of the ease had gone out of her voice. I looked her dead in the eye. "The sheriff's department." That emptied the warmth out of the room fast. The woman with the clipboard set it down on the sawhorses like it had suddenly gotten heavy. Frank actually stood up off the crate. Deborah laughed, short, thin, missing most of its air. "Walter, come on, there's no need for that. We're family." I pressed the call button anyway. When the dispatcher answered, I gave her my name, my address, and said plainly, "There are people inside my property who don't have my permission to be here. They've brought commercial photography equipment and printed marketing materials for a business venture I never authorized. I want a deputy out here, and I want this documented." Frank set his phone down on the crate. That was the first sensible thing anyone in that room did all morning. While we waited, nobody measured anything else. Nobody climbed the ladder again. Deborah tried twice to explain herself further, and both times I held up a hand and said, "Save it." The deputy arrived 20 minutes later. Her name was Deputy Aisha Torres, and she had the kind of steady, unhurried manner that told you immediately she'd heard every version of this story there was to hear. I handed her my driver's license, the property tax statement I kept in the truck for exactly this kind of nonsense, and pulled up the recorded deed on my phone. Deborah tried to interject twice, and both times Deputy Torres said, without raising her voice at all, "Ma'am, I'm speaking with the property owner right now." That sentence did more work in 5 seconds than an hour of my own shouting could have managed. I walked Deputy Torres through the workshop, the tape measure, the sawhorses full of brochures, the photographer's ladder, the swatches. She photographed all of it. Then, on a folding table near the door, she found something that mattered more than any of it. A printed listing agreement, already signed by Deborah and Frank Anand, naming them as authorized representatives for a property they had no legal standing to represent, alongside a rental license application already submitted to the county under the business name Coastline Staging and Design. Deputy Torres held it up, looked at Deborah, and asked one simple question. "Ma'am, whose name is on this deed?" Deborah didn't answer. Her face went the color of old drywall. Deputy Torres told everyone present they had to leave the property immediately, and that returning without written permission from me would be treated as trespassing, full stop. She took names, license plates, and gave me a case number written in tight, careful handwriting on the back of her card. Deborah stood in the gravel while Frank loaded the cargo van, looking at me the entire time like I was the one who'd broken something. "You're making a bigger deal out of this than it needs to be," she said quietly, once the photographer was out of earshot. "Priya's not going to appreciate you humiliating her mother like this." I looked past her toward the workshop, toward the door Ellen used to prop open with a brick shaped like a duck. "Deborah," I said, "the only person humiliating you today is you." She opened her mouth. Nothing useful came out of it. A locksmith from town arrived before the dust from the sheriff's cruiser had even settled. I'd called him from the driveway while the van was still loading. He rekeyed both doors, replaced the old keypad on the gate, wiped every stored code, and mounted a small camera above the side entrance while I stood there and watched, arms crossed, like I was guarding something already lost once, and wasn't about to let it happen twice. By early afternoon, every old code that had ever existed on that property was dead. Then I called Michael. He answered cheerful, the way he always does before he knows what's coming. "Hey, Dad, what's up?" I closed my eyes for a second before I answered. "Son, did you or Priya give Deborah the gate code to the workshop?" A pause, longer than I liked. "Yeah," he said slowly. "Last winter, before your trip to see Aunt Carol, we asked her to check on the place while you were gone." "Why? Did you tell her she could bring a real estate crew out there? Photograph the beams? Draft a rental listing?" "What?" His voice changed on that single word, dropped a full register. "Dad, what are you talking about?" I told him everything, plain and in order. The vehicles, the brochures, the ladder, the listing agreement, the sheriff, the case number. By the time I finished, I could hear Priya's voice in the background asking what was wrong, and then Michael saying, low and tight, "Get your mother on the phone right now." If you've ever sat with your own child while they realized somebody they trusted had made decisions behind their back using your name as cover, you know it isn't clean anger. It's closer to grief wearing anger's coat. That evening, Tomas finally showed up, having gotten tangled in another job across town. He found me sitting on the church pew, which somebody had at least dragged back inside before they left, with 2 sandwiches I hadn't touched and Ellen's old tool chest open beside me. I'd checked it the moment everyone left. Nothing missing, but somebody had pulled her hand-labeled drawer of chisels out and left it sitting open on the bench, like a display piece for a showing. Tomas stood there a minute, cap in his hands. "Rough one," he said. "Just became a documented one," I told him. He nodded like that made all the sense in the world, which, around here, it does. The next morning I called my attorney, Renata Ford. Renata is 61, wears reading glasses on a beaded chain she never actually uses, and has the calm, unhurried patience of someone who has genuinely seen it all twice. She handled Ellen's estate paperwork and knows every inch of that property better than most people know their own kitchens. I gave her the case number, emailed the photos, forwarded the listing agreement Deputy Torres had let me keep a copy of. I told her about Deborah's comment that the workshop would become Michael and Priya's eventually anyway. Renata was quiet a long moment. Then she said, "Walter, that wasn't a misunderstanding. That was a business plan waiting on your absence." Over the following week, more pieces surfaced. The county confirmed a rental license application had in fact been filed, listing Coastline Staging and Design as the managing entity, with Frank Annan's cell number as the primary contact. A local sign shop called asking if Mrs. Anand still wanted the custom-carved sign, finished the Higgins Barn, same font as a boutique inn 2 towns over. My neighbor down the road, a retired schoolteacher named Opal, mentioned she'd seen Deborah's Lexus parked at my gate 3 separate times over the previous month, always midweek, always while I was known around the neighborhood to be at my Tuesday coffee group. When Opal told me about the sign shop call, I didn't say anything for a good 10 seconds. If somebody's willing to put a new name on something your late wife helped build with her own 2 hands, they've stopped asking permission. They're simply waiting for you to stay too polite to notice. I was finished being polite in ways that only benefited people who'd already decided what was theirs. Renata sent certified notices to Deborah and Frank Anand, and a separate letter to the sign shop and the county rental licensing office formally revoking any claimed authority connected to the property. She sent a 3rd letter to Michael and Priya, not accusing either of them, but stating clearly that neither held any legal authority to grant third-party access, and that the code shared the previous winter had been strictly for a single, limited purpose. She also drafted an invoice covering the rekeying, the camera installation, and a formal property damage inspection for the tool chest and workbench surface. It came to $1,940.75. Not a fortune. Enough to mean something. Deborah called the day she received the letter. I let it go to voicemail. She called again. I let that go too. On the 3rd call I picked up and said, "You have Renata's number now." She came in hot. "You sent me an invoice like I'm some kind of criminal." "I sent you a consequence," I said, "for entering private property without permission, filing a business license using a location you don't own, and putting your hands on my late wife's tools like they were inventory." She went quiet at wife, not out of respect, out of recalculation. "You're going to turn Michael against his own mother-in-law over this," she said. "No," I said. "You may have already managed that on your own. I'm trying to help this family build something, Walter. You can't stay stubborn about this forever." I looked out through the workshop window at the dogwood Ellen had planted the spring. Michael started walking. "Watch me," I said, and hung up. 3 days later, Deborah proved she'd absorbed exactly none of it. My new camera sent an alert to my phone at 8:50 on a Saturday morning. I was home in my slippers, the ones Ellen used to call an embarrassment to the family name, drinking coffee at my own kitchen table. The screen showed Deborah at the gate, her Lexus idling behind her, Frank in the passenger seat looking like a man who badly wanted to be somewhere else. She punched the old code into the new keypad. Nothing. She tried it twice more, then grabbed the gate itself and rattled it like sheer conviction might override the hardware. I called Deputy Torres's direct line and gave her the case number. A deputy arrived 14 minutes later. I watched the whole thing live on my phone, coffee going cold in my hand. Deborah gestured toward the workshop. The deputy gestured toward the road. Deborah pulled out a folder of papers and waved them around. The deputy shook his head and said something that made her shoulders drop. Then she climbed back into the Lexus, reversed too fast, and left gravel dust hanging in the air behind her. That was the first time I actually smiled through any of it. Not because I enjoyed her humiliation, but because the system had done exactly what it was supposed to do the moment I finally let it. On Sunday, Michael and Priya came out to my house. Priya hugged me at the door and held on longer than usual, the way people do when they're apologizing with their whole body because words aren't quite enough yet. Michael stood behind her looking like a man who hadn't slept right in days. Good. Some sleep is supposed to go missing when your family's trust gets handed to the wrong person. We sat at my kitchen table. I put out coffee nobody touched. Priya went first. "Walter, I'm so sorry." I waited. She kept going. "My mom asked for the code back in December. Said she just wanted to check on the pipes while you were traveling. I told her that was fine, one time, for that reason only. I had no idea she'd kept it, let alone used it, for she stopped, shook her head. That's not an excuse." "No," I said, "it isn't." Michael looked at his own wife, not unkindly. Worse than unkindly, clearly. Priya nodded like she already knew what was coming. I asked one question. "Did you know about the listing agreement?" "No." "Did you know about the sign shop?" "No." Did you know she'd already filed a rental license with the county? Priya's face went completely blank. What? I told her about the Higgins barn, the exact font, the boutique inn 2 towns over. Priya put both hands over her face. That was the moment I stopped being angry at her specifically. Not because she was blameless, she wasn't, but because shame had accomplished something my anger never could have. Priya looked up at me across the table. What happens now? I'd been waiting on that question the whole drive back from the sheriff's visit. Now, I said, we make certain this can never happen again, to anyone, under any explanation. Renata came out to my house the following Thursday with a leather folder and a pen that only wrote in black because she said blue looked indecisive on a signature page. Michael and Priya arrived separately. I didn't ask which one of them had slept on the couch the night before. Marriage has doors a father-in-law shouldn't kick open unless somebody's genuinely trapped behind one. Renata walked us through the documents, slow and plain. First, the workshop and its parcel would move into the Higgins family trust. I'd control it fully while I was living. Michael would hold full beneficial rights after I passed, but the property could never be sold, leased, listed, renamed, or used commercially without trustee approval, in writing, with my signature or Renata's as successor trustee. No in-law, no friend, no extended family member of any kind would hold independent access rights, ever, regardless of who let them in once. Access codes would be individually assigned, logged, and revocable at will. Second, any future claim to the property or its proceeds through marriage would require a properly drafted postnuptial agreement, independent counsel on both sides, no exceptions. Michael had already spoken with his own lawyer. He chose, on his own, to sign a written acknowledgement that the workshop was separate Higgins family property, and that Priya's family held no rights to it, present or future, under any circumstance. Third, Renata drew up a separate trade and education fund for any grandchildren. I might one day have money set aside specifically for tools, training, or a trade apprenticeship, should any grandchild of mine ever want to learn to build something with their hands the way I did. Priya cried reading that part out loud. Michael did too, though he pretended the sawdust in the room was to blame. There was one more document. A letter to Deborah and Frank Anand, copied through Renata, formally barring them from the property, the gate, and any structure on it. It included the case number, the Saturday gate incident, the unpaid invoice, and a firm payment deadline. Michael read it twice. Then he looked at me and said, "I'll cover it myself, so this stops being a fight." "No," Priya said. We all turned toward her. She wiped her face, sat up straight in her chair, and looked directly at her husband. "They pay it. Not you, not us, them." Michael stared at her a second, then nodded slowly. "You're right." That was the first moment I let myself believe they might come out of this steadier than they'd gone in. But Deborah wasn't finished. People like her don't accept a closed door until they've bruised a shoulder against it at least once more. 2 weeks later, she drove to Michael and Priya's place uninvited. I found out because Priya called me from the upstairs bathroom while Michael kept her mother occupied downstairs. Her voice was shaking with anger, not fear. "She's telling Michael I'm being manipulated by you," Priya said. "She's saying he should never have signed anything." "What do you want me to do?" I asked. A pause. Then my daughter-in-law said, "Come over. Bring Renata if she can make it." Renata could always make it for exactly this kind of trouble. We arrived within the half hour. Deborah stood in Priya and Michael's living room, red in the face, one finger jabbing toward Michael's chest. Frank sat stiff on the sofa with his hands in his lap like a man waiting out somebody else's storm. Deborah turned when I walked in. "You," she said. "Me," I said. Renata stepped in behind me, folder in hand, that same black pen tucked behind her ear, like she'd known she'd need it again. Deborah looked at the folder and actually laughed. "More paperwork?" Renata said. "Yes, and I've enjoyed very few phrases in my career more than that one." She handed Deborah a copy of the trespass notice, the unpaid invoice, and the camera footage, still from the Saturday gate incident, printed and time-stamped. Then a final letter stating that any further contact regarding the property, the trust, the invoice, or any future inheritance matter would go strictly through counsel from that point forward. Deborah read it, and the color drained out of her face one line at a time. "You people are unbelievable," she said. Priya walked down from upstairs. She'd been crying, but she was past that part now. "No," she said. "We're done being convenient." Deborah turned toward her own daughter. "Priya, you don't understand what your father-in-law is doing to this family." "I understand exactly what he's doing," Priya said. He's protecting something my husband's mother helped build from someone who tried to put a stranger's business name on it. Frank flinched at that, just slightly. That told me he'd known about the sign the whole time, too. Deborah looked at Michael. Are you actually going to let her speak to me like that? Michael stood beside his wife. Not in front of her, not behind her, beside her. Yes, he said. One word. Possibly the best word he'd said in his whole adult life. Deborah's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Renata tapped the invoice once with the pen. Payments due Friday. Frank stood and picked up his jacket. Debbie, he said quietly, let's go. She looked around that living room, searching for somebody who'd hand her back the old rules, the ones where family meant unlimited access and unlimited forgiveness. Nobody in that room did. They left without slamming the door, which surprised me. But I've come to learn that real defeat is usually too heavy to carry a slam along with it. The invoice arrived paid, by check, 2 days later. The workshop stayed quiet through the rest of that summer. In August, Michael and Priya drove out with me on a Saturday. Michael fixed the side door hinges himself, the ones I'd never gotten around to without being asked. Priya swept the floor and set Ellen's chipped green mug back on the shelf above the bench, right where it had always sat. I watched her do it from the doorway, and with the afternoon light coming in gold through the window and Ellen's mug back in its place in somebody else's careful hands, I had to look away for a second. That evening we sat outside on the church pew as the light went soft and the cicadas started up loud in the trees. Michael stood near the fire pit, nervous, holding a paper bag rolled shut at the top. I brought something, he said. He pulled out a small wooden sign, sanded smooth, still smelling faintly of finish. My chest tightened before I let myself look at it properly. Then he turned it around. It read, Hidgens Woodshop, not new letters. The original name, the one that used to hang over the side door before it rotted through years ago and I never got around to replacing it. He'd found an old photograph of the place from the 90s, back when Ellen was still alive to see it hanging, and had a local craftsman carve it to match, letter for letter. I know I can't undo what my mother-in-law did with just one sign, Michael said, but I wanted the right name back where it belongs. I took it from him. My hands weren't as steady as I wanted them to be. Get the drill, I said. We hung it together above the side door as the sun dropped behind the ridge. Deborah and Frank have never come back out to that property. They've never apologized either, though I stopped waiting on that particular miracle a while ago. Some people treat an apology like a coupon. They only bother using it when they think it'll get them something back. Michael and Priya are still married. Better, if you want my honest opinion, than they were before all this. Not easier. Better. There's a real difference between those two words, and it took watching my own son learn it the hard way for me to fully believe it myself. Michael learned that peace bought by staying quiet about your own boundaries isn't peace. It's just delay wearing a nicer outfit. Priya learned that loving your mother doesn't mean covering for her, and that the two things were never actually connected to begin with. And I learned that protecting what your family built sometimes means putting up walls solid enough that the people you love can finally put their arms down and stop holding the door shut themselves. If there's one thing worth carrying out of tonight with you, it's this. The mistake most of us make is believing boundaries and love live on opposite sides of some line. The truth is, the clearest boundary you ever draw is very often the most loving thing you'll ever leave behind for the people who come after you. And here's something worth sitting with tonight, whoever's listening. Is there something in your own life, a place, a business, a piece of your history that you've let people quietly assume belongs to them, simply because you never said otherwise out loud? The Higgins Family Trust is signed, funded, and sitting safe in Renata's office, with a full copy locked in my own safe at home. The workshop has a camera now, individually assigned codes, and a gate that shuts with a solid, satisfying sound I never get tired of hearing. The Trade and Education Fund is sitting there too, waiting. No grandchildren yet, but I've got time, and good things built the right way are worth waiting on. Last month, I drove out there alone for the first time in a while, just to sit. The air smelled like cut grass and machine oil. I opened the side door under that new old sign, set my thermos down, and walked straight over to the church pew by the window. I sat there a good while, listening to the birds start up outside, Ellen's chipped green mug sitting empty on the shelf above the bench. I smiled at that. A workshop with an empty mug on the shelf still means somebody's expected back. Just not everybody. Not anymore. I'd genuinely like to know what you think about how this whole thing played out. Drop a 1 in the comments if you think I handled it exactly right by calling the sheriff the moment I found them there. Drop a 2 if you think I should have confronted Deborah myself first before bringing in law enforcement. Or drop a 3 if you think Priya should have been held to a harder standard for handing over that code in the first place, even just the once. Tell me where you're watching from tonight, son or daughter, or whatever brought you here, and what time it is where you are right now. And if somebody in your own family has ever quietly assumed ownership over something that was never theirs to claim, I'd love to hear that story from you too. If tonight meant something to you, go ahead and hit subscribe, because there's more of these coming stories about the slow, patient work of protecting the people and the places that actually matter. Thank you for sitting with me tonight. I'll see you in the next one.